Acts 21:27. While you're turning there, last time we saw Paul, he has arrived at Jerusalem finally. He's enjoyed a time of fellowship with the saints when he first gets there. And then he meets with James and the other elders from the Jerusalem church. And they want to try to reconcile those who are zealous of the law. There are thousands of them. And he wants to reconcile them with Paul and these other Gentile believers that have come with Paul. And so they have been told that Paul has been teaching the Jews in the Gentile part of the world to forsake the Mosaic law and to not circumcise their children and not to follow the Jewish customs. Even though that was not true, they wanted Paul to give a sign for the Jewish people that he was basically pro-Jewish. And they offer a compromise, those leaders from that church. And there were 4 men who were under a Nazirite vow, and that was coming to an end, and they wanted Paul to go with them and go through the ceremony of the end of the Nazirite vow and finish the purification process and offer the sacrifices. And as a gesture that Paul was for that, they wanted him to pay for the whole thing, the cost of it, and that would somehow reconcile them together. It did not. And so we don't compromise on God's Word. Paul knew those ceremonies and things didn't mean anything anymore, but they influenced him, and which was pretty rare for Paul to have somebody convince him to do something like that. All through this journey, they've been telling him, don't go to Jerusalem, don't go to Jerusalem, don't go to Jerusalem. And he says, I'm going to Jerusalem. God's leading me to Jerusalem. And so he was set on that, but in this one, he did waver, and his intention was good, but it didn't work out that way. And so that's going to be even more exaggerated this evening as we see his arrest here in these verses. In verse 27, Acts 21:27, read down through verse 40. Actually pick up a couple verses. I know this will be in next week's lesson in chapter 22, but just so we can reference some of that this evening. Acts 21:27, he says, And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating of Paul. Then the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. And some cried one thing, some another among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. And when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, Away with him! And as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, May I speak unto thee? Who said, Canst thou speak Greek? Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days madest an uproar, and leddest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? But Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. And I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, in verse 1 and 2 there of chapter 22, Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make now unto you. And when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence, and he saith. And so we'll continue what he says next time. But as we go through these verses, it's a pretty lengthy description of the trials that Paul goes through, and so we're going to have to break it down into smaller segments there. But but he's going to make actually 6 defenses throughout this series here. He's going to defend himself before the mob. He's going to defend himself before the Sanhedrin Council. He is going to defend himself before 2 governors, Felix and Festus, before the king, and then before the Jewish people themselves. And so over the course of these events, he'll be in 3 places. He'll be here in Jerusalem, he'll be in Caesarea, and then in Rome finally there at the end. And so he's been accused of illegal activity. And so Paul hasn't done anything illegal, but most people, if you get accused of a crime wrongly, what's your go-to move? I didn't do it. And you seek to prove those type of things. Paul is going to do some of that along the way. But the focus for him in this situation where he's falsely accused, he's arrested, he's put on trial, his focus is still to present the gospel. That's the most important thing of all. And so some of these people that he'll be talking to are Jewish people that have rejected the gospel. They're not, we talked about there were some in James's church there who were zealots. They were extremists there. And so some of those zealots, though, weren't saved people. They're unsaved. And so some of them have heard the gospel. They've just rejected it before this time. They'll get to hear it again when Paul stands here and gives his testimony. But some of this group may have never have heard it up until this point. Maybe some of these soldiers and the officials there at the Temple Mountain, but because of their position and their responsibilities, they'll get to hear it too. And so Paul is going to get some opportunities that maybe he hasn't had with that group before this, and wouldn't have unless he were being arrested at this time. And it's really a good example for us about how to give the good news of the gospel in bad situations. And everybody goes through those type of things, and they're hard times and struggles and those type of things. Now, when we're talking about bad situations, we're not talking about when other people are going through bad situations. We're talking about when we go through those things, because Paul's the one that's going through this struggle here. He's the one being falsely accused. He's the one being arrested, and he's still giving the good news of the gospel. And so Paul knows that God has ordained this. How could he forget? Because every town he came through on the way back to Jerusalem, what are they saying? You're going to be bound. You're going to be afflicted. Don't go. Right? And he knows that already, but it doesn't matter. God's going to use him through this. He's going to lose his freedom, though, by the world standards. He's not going to be able to come and go as he did before. But if you see this verse, and when he writes Philippians, he's under house arrest when he writes the book of Philippians in verse 1:13. He describes it this way. He says, so that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in all other places. And so he views himself as a prisoner of Christ. He says, God has done this. God has allowed all of this to happen. I'm not a prisoner of Rome. I'm not a prisoner of the Jewish people. I'm a prisoner of Christ. God has me right where he wants me to be. And that's what he uses, those circumstances there. In verse 27 again, you see the mob attacks him there, verse 27. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him. So after 7 days, that's the purification process there at the end of the Nazarite vow. That's the 7 days there. And these Jews are from Asia. Now that's Asia Minor. That's where Ephesus and those cities from Pergamos and the 7 churches from Revelation, that's where all of those are over in Asia Minor there. And so that's what he's talking about. But Ephesus is there, and that's where Paul spent so much of his time there. 3 years, you remember, he was teaching and preaching in Ephesus. And that was a launching point for the beginning of several other churches in that area. The gospel spreads from there to almost all Asia. Right? And so that's having a great effect on that part of the world there. And so, but he had taught, you remember, he said, I cease not to teach you night and day. And you remember we saw examples of that. He's not only teaching in the synagogue initially there, but he was teaching in the school of Tyrannus. You remember that was a rented building. Most people wouldn't do anything right in the middle of the heat of the day, and including school and those type of things. And so when that building was empty, he says, hey, I'll use it. And he uses that building to share the gospel and to teach. And of course he goes from house to house also there. And when this man there named Trophimus is mentioned there in verse 29, if you look ahead there a couple verses, he's an Ephesian. They know he's an Ephesian. And so they know his name, I believe. And so I believe that this group of people that recognizes him were actually from that area around Ephesus, somewhere there in Asia Minor there, because they know who he is, they know who Paul is, and they are the ones who are inciting this crowd there. And so if you remember, the leader of the synagogue in Ephesus had gotten saved. You remember that guy's name? Apollos was that one. There were some others, right? But Apollos was that one, right? And Apollos was there, and Aquila and Priscilla, you remember, had expounded to him the way of the gospel more perfectly. He had some understanding of Scripture, but he didn't have enough yet to understand the gospel. And so that guy gets saved. You remember, they held church in the Jewish synagogue in Ephesus for a while. And finally it got to the point where the Jews said, no, we can't go along with this. And they basically separated after that point. But Ephesus is also the place where they had the riot in the theater. You remember that? And the people there, they couldn't find Paul, so they dragged a couple of his companions in there, Gaius and Aristarchus. They drugged them in the theater. You remember they're yelling, great is the Diana, the god of the Ephesians. And there for 2 hours, wasn't it, that they just won't let the guy talk, and it's a riot, right? And you remember a lot of those people didn't even know why they were there. They were so confused, and they knew it was a stir, and there was a lot of excitement and hatred and those kind of things, but they wanted to kill Paul at that time. They just couldn't find him. You remember, Paul was going to go in the theater, and they said, don't go in there. His friends told him not to. Some of the officials from the city said, don't go in there, you'll make it worse. Just stay out. And you remember at that time, it's the Roman authorities that actually stopped that rebellion, because they said, if Rome finds out that we've had this type of a riot in our city, right, they were allowed to self-rule basically. But every city that's allowed to self-rule still has to maintain the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And so they said, if they find out we've had this riot here and have no good reason, these people haven't done anything illegal that we can accuse them of. If they find that out, we'll be in some serious trouble about that. And you remember, he dismisses the crowd there at that point. And so, but here in Jerusalem, there is a huge concentration of Jews in Jerusalem. And many of those Jews have no fear of the Roman authorities. And you say, well, how is that? How is it that they don't really fear the Roman authorities at this time? Because they're subject to Rome at this time. Well, Pilate is the main reason. Pilate has become like a pawn for the Judaizers, the Jews there who rejected Christ. You remember when Pilate first took over, and I can't remember what we were studying when we talked about this, but they had actually went to Caesar multiple times to complain about some of the things that Pilate had done when he first started ruling. And when he did those things, the Jewish people went there and caused a big stir to Caesar, and Caesar says, "Stop that." And they went back again, and he says, "Stop that." Right? And he goes, he's on his last limb here. Right? And he is a governor He's been assigned this rule, and it's basically if he stirs up some more trouble, Caesar will just replace him. Right? He'll be out. And so they're basically blackmailing Pilate. That's how they got him to crucify Christ. That they were blackmailing him. In John 19:12 it says, "And from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar." And they were bringing that threat. You keep this up, right? This guy's supposed to be the king of the Jews. We'll go tell Caesar again, and you'll be out. And that's the threat. And so, remember 3 times, I believe it was, that Pilate said, "I find no fault in him at all. I find no fault in him." And wanted to release him. Even beat him and bloodied him and brought him out and showed him that way to the people and thought that'll appease them. And they said, no, crucify him. That's the only thing we'll be content with. And he did. But against his wife's advice, against his own moral conscience that this was an innocent man, he allowed them to do it. And so he's being blackmailed by the people. So they don't really have any fear of Pilate and those authorities in that instance there. And so now they're going to try to use that same approach to get rid of Paul that they used with Jesus. And so these may have been some of the same ones here in Jerusalem that were plotting to kill Paul on the boat before he headed this direction. Back in Acts 20, verse 3, there back in that last chapter, he says, "And there abode 3 months, and when the Jews laid wait for him as he was about to sail into Syria, he purposed to return through Macedonia." Remember, he got word that somebody was going to kill him on the boat, and he says, "I think I'll go back this direction for a little while, and then we'll reroute. We don't really have to be there for Passover. I think Pentecost will do just fine." And so he takes a little detour there. And so, but Acts 21:7 there again, he says, "And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him." Stirred up all the people is sungeho, which means to throw into disorder or to confuse. They were intentionally confusing the people there. And so, same kind of thing that went on with Ephesus in the theater, where the majority of them didn't even know why they were there. And that's what they're doing. They're just trying to get them agitated, even though they don't know really what it's about. There in that same verse where it says they laid hands on him, that's not an arrest. It's not like you grab him. That is a word that means to beat with the hands. They're punching him. They're slapping him. They're doing anything to harm him. You see that there in the later verses when they realize the chief captain and the centurions are coming down, and they left off beating him. That's what they were doing at this time. They're trying to beat him to death. There in that verse. Verse 28, he says, "Crying out, Men of Israel, help. This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law in this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place." Now, this is at the time of Pentecost, and that's 50 days. That's what Pentecost means, 50th. It's 50 days after the Feast of Passover. And the Feast of Pentecost coincided with the first fruits of the wheat harvest. Now, the first fruits of the year is the barley harvest. That's what happens. The first fruits and the Passover, that's all at the barley harvest, when they first harvest the barley. 50 days later is when they get the first fruits of the wheat harvest. And so that's what's going on here. The Feast of the Pentecost also coincided with the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. With Moses after the exodus out of Egypt. It also coincides with when God sent the Comforter, the Holy Ghost. That was 50 days after Passover. He was here on the earth for 40 days, and you remember Jesus said, I go to my Father, but I'll send the Comforter. That happened 10 days later, the 50th day. That was on the day of Pentecost, and we know about that revival and Peter and all of those things there. And so for most of the Jews who come here for Pentecost, it only represents the birthday, if you will, of the giving of the law. That's all they're celebrating. They're not celebrating anything about Christ. They're not celebrating the giving of the Holy Spirit. It's only the giving of the law. That's what they're celebrating. And so what they're claiming here is the people are celebrating the giving of the law, and they're claiming Paul is anti-law, that he's against the Mosaic law there, which is only partially true. Paul's not against the law at all, per se. But there are parts of the law that have been fulfilled. And so he's definitely for the moral law that still applies today. But he's not going to be for the parts about the sacrifices of animals, because Christ has already come. He's already been the perfect sacrifice. Some of those ceremonies that were pointing to Christ, Christ has already come. He's already fulfilled those. There's no need to celebrate something to look forward to it when it's already happened. And so that's the idea there. But they're stirring up these Jews who are celebrating the giving of the law and making like Paul is an enemy of the law. And so they start beating him there in verse 28. They cry out. I like how they cry out for help. They start beating him, and then, it's a whole bunch of people there gathered in there. When you see later on, they describe it to the chief captain, and he said the whole city's in an uproar. So it's a lot of people that are trying to get to Paul, trying to beat him, and they say, help, meaning everybody join in on this. That's what they were trying to get. Everybody be involved in this, and so they want him to help put an end to his life. I love what they say about Paul, though. They say, this is the man that teacheth all men everywhere. Now that's a pretty amazing testimony for God, to be accused of teaching everywhere and to all people. That's a wonderful testimony. Even though what they were claiming he was teaching was inaccurate, it's still a wonderful testimony to Paul's life there. So here are some of the accusations they make. First of all, they claimed he was teaching against the people. Now what people was Paul supposedly teaching against? The Jews. The Jews. Right? They're claiming that Paul is anti-Semitic. That's what it means, anti-Jewish. They're anti-Semitic, and that's really quite a joke, isn't it? Right? Every place Paul goes, where does he go first if they have one? The synagogue. Right? The synagogue. Any city he goes in, he tries to go to the synagogue first and tell them about Jesus. If they don't have a synagogue, like with Lydia and them, they're meeting down by the river, right? And that's where he goes. He tries to go to the Jewish people first, and then when they reject him, he does go to others there. But he's reaching out to them first. In Romans 9:3, he writes this about willing even to give up his own salvation if the Jews would accept Christ. He writes this, Romans 9:3, for I could wish that myself were accursed. That's what he's saying. I could wish that I were accursed, that I was under the curse of God. And then at the end of this verse, he says, for I could wish that myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my kinsmen, according to the flesh. Now we know that's a fleshly desire, and it's not even possible. But he says, if it were possible, he says, I could give up my own salvation to have all the Jews saved. That's how much he loved them. And so that's a wonderful testimony. But in Judaism, their religion is tied to their race, to their heritage there. And so they claim that if a person rejected Judaism, that they were actually rejecting their own race. They were rejecting being Jewish. That's what they felt. The truth is, Jesus was the Jews' Messiah, first of all. To the Jew first, then to the Gentile. The Jews were supposed to be the light to lighten the Gentiles, not the other way around, which is what's happening in this age there. And so the truth is, those who rejected Jesus as the Messiah, especially the Jews, they were rejecting their Jewish heritage because Jesus was their Messiah, first of all. And so in that same verse there, another claim, they also claim that he was teaching against the law. Right? They claimed that he was against this place. Now this place is talking about the Temple Mount where they're at this time. And so they also claimed that he had defiled the temple by bringing Greeks or Gentiles into the restricted areas. There in verse 29 he says, "For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple." They supposed that Paul had taken Trophimus into the area where only the Jews were allowed to go, but they didn't actually see it there. I brought these maps this evening, and you can see, I've got another one here in a minute. And of course, this is the whole Temple Mount. The court of the Gentiles is out on this outer area here. Anybody can go in there. Right? Anybody can go in the court of the Gentiles. And so when you get to this point right here, and it says there are screens which Gentiles were prohibited. And there are some screens. Now you can walk in between these, but it's an obvious barrier there. And I'll show you another picture. You can maybe get a little better idea. See those little walls right here? They go around. That's the barrier. It goes all around these three sides. Of course, there's no entrance in the back of the temple there, but they can walk through these openings. But on these barricaded walls, the court of the Gentiles can go anywhere up here on the outside. They can go nowhere inside that barrier. Gentiles can't. Nowhere are they allowed to be in there. And they actually have, if you look back on this other map, there's different layers, and of course the Gentiles can go anywhere out here on the outside. You got in this next barricade the court of women, see that right there, and then inside this next area, the Jewish women could go in the court of women. That's why it's called that. When you go in this next area there, the Jewish men could go in. When you go into this next area, only the priests could go in. When you get to the Holy of Holies, right, the most sacred part, only the high priest could go in there only once a year. And so every time you get closer and closer to the Ark of the Covenant, it's more restricted who's allowed to go into that. But on those barricades that you see around this, they had signs posted. Right? They were written in Latin. Now Latin's the language of Rome. That was their language. It's not the dominant language at this time, but it is their language. The dominant language is Greek. Because the Greek Empire made sure of that when they took over, but it's kind of passed on now to the Roman Empire there. But Greek, it was written, those signs were written around those barricades there in Latin and in Greek there. And so archaeologists have actually discovered a couple of them, one in 1871, another one in 1935. They both said the exact same thing. This is what it says on those signs. No man of alien race is to enter within the barricade that goes around the temple. And if anyone is taken in the act, let him know that he has himself to blame for the penalty of death that follows. If a Gentile goes inside this barricade, right, and they catch him there or her there, the penalty is death there. And the Romans honored that. They honored that law, and they wouldn't allow them to go in there. And so they've accused Paul of taking Trophimus in there. Paul did not take Trophimus in there. Why not? Trophimus is his friend. He doesn't want his friend to die He knows that's the penalty. The signs are posted. Everybody knows that. It's common knowledge there. Now, they want to kill Paul because he supposedly took Trophimus in there. But according to their law, if he took Trophimus in there, who dies? Trophimus, not Paul. Paul is Jewish. He wouldn't be killed. His friend would be killed. But they said, oh, he took him in there. And by their logic, they're saying, well, let's kill Paul instead of Trophimus there. That's an absurd accusation there. We understand that. There in verse 30 of Acts 21, he says, and all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And so the mob's confused. Paul is inside the barricade. He's allowed inside the temple also. Right? He's allowed in this area, not the T-shaped area you see here on the top. That's over top of the temple itself. He's not allowed in there. He's not a priest or a high priest. But he is allowed all these other areas inside. So he's inside the temple there at some point. And now they drag him out. Right? And they've attacked him. And now God's actually going to use the Roman authorities to rescue Paul. There in verse 31 and 32, we see his arrest by the Romans. He says, and as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating of Paul. And so on the north side of the Temple Mount, you can see it over here. There, I'll give you an aerial view of that. This is Fort Antonia, or the Antonia Fortress. There. That's what that is, and you see it in this picture. There has these towers coming up, and they are looking out over the Temple Mount. That's the whole purpose of Fort Antonia, to keep order on the Temple Mount there. And they, at least 1,000 skilled soldiers were kept in Fort Antonio during the feast times. There, 1,000 of them there. And so they have a chief captain who's the head of the 1,000. His name, if you look ahead to Acts 23:26, he gives his name there. He's not giving his name here, but when he writes a letter to the governor, he does tell his name. There he says, Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor Felix sendeth greetings. And so he's telling about Paul and sending him there, and so he uses his name. But they didn't tolerate violations of the peace of Rome, the Pax Romana, here at the Temple Mount. If they have any kind of disturbances, they just issue the soldiers out. They deal with it there. And so when they see this outburst here and the people start beating Paul to death, they see that from the towers. They send them down. You can see the steps. I don't know if you can see it or not, but there's the steps coming out of the tower that leads directly down into this courtyard. Right? That's where they come out of there to get to the courtyard there. And so they send down, the chief captain sends down, they have the centurions. Centurions are the heads of 100 people, and so they've got 100 people coming with each centurion there to do this. And so they come rushing down in there. When they see the chief captain and the soldiers coming, they stopped beating Paul. Now, why do people stop doing something when they see the police? They knew they were doing something wrong, right? They knew they were doing something wrong, something illegal there. Verse 33 of Acts 21. Then the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains and demanded who he was and what he had done. So they arrest Paul, they bind him with 2 chains, and then they're going to try to figure out who he is and what he's done. And so he assumes that Paul has done something pretty bad, or the crowd, the religious crowd here at the Temple Mount, wouldn't be acting this way toward him in such a violent way And this is, by the way, a fulfillment of prophecy from back in verse 11. Remember Agabus, Acts 21:11. He says, and when he was coming to us, he took Paul's girdle and bound his own hands and feet and said, thus saith the Holy Ghost, so shall the Jews at Jerusalem bind the man that owneth this girdle and shall deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles. That's the fulfillment of this. Here he is, bound with those chains, delivered to the Roman authorities there. Verse 34 of Acts 21, he says, and some cried one thing, some another among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. They don't ask Paul what he's done or who he is. They ask the Jews who he is and what he's done. And they haven't got their story straight. They've already made up some lies about him, stirred up the people and confused them, tried to beat him to death. And so some are saying one thing, some are saying another thing, and he doesn't have any idea what's going on. And so they take him inside the fort. And so they're going to take him up those same steps there into the fort. Verse 35. And when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for violence of the people. They're carrying Paul. Right? Why are they carrying him? The people, when they realize that the Roman authorities aren't going to have him killed, right, at this moment anyway, they're going to try to continue what they've started and beat him to death. That's what they're going to try to do. And so they're actually holding him up over their head and carrying him up the stairs to get him into the fort, to get him away from the people until they can figure out what he's done and if he deserves to die or not. Verse 36, he says, for the multitude of the people followed after, crying, away with him. That should sound familiar, shouldn't it? That's the same thing that the crowd cried toward Jesus. In John 19:15, but they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. There. And so in all of this, you see the humility of Paul. Right? He reacts very similarly the way Jesus did at his trials. Right? At this point, Paul hasn't said anything, has he? Nothing. There. He doesn't get loud. He doesn't try to fight him off. He hasn't even defended himself yet. Now, if you look ahead, I just wanted to read that verse in chapter 22 and verse 1, just so you see. He's getting ready to give his defense. Now, when we say a defense in a trial, you're accused of something and you're just trying to prove your innocence. That's not what Paul's doing here. Paul is giving the reason for his life, the reason for his desire to share the gospel with others. There in 22:1 he says, men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense which I make now unto you. And so that word defense is apologia. We get our word apologetic, or the reason for his answer. And Paul described it that way. Peter described it the same way. 1 Peter 3:15 uses the same word. He says, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. He says, be ready to explain why you believe this, what you believe. That's what he's defending here, not his innocence. There, and that's important. Right? In verse 37, Acts 21, back up in our original text, he says, and so Paul was to be led into the castle. He said unto the chief captain, may I speak unto thee? Who said, canst thou speak Greek? Now he asked to speak to the chief captain, who in return asked him if he can speak Greek. Right? Now, of course, Paul can. He's been all over the Gentile world. But this man thinks Paul is an uncultured barbarian. That's what he thinks he is there. That he's just stirring up trouble in the temple. And the chief captain actually has a specific person in mind that he thinks Paul is there. In verse 38 he says, art not thou that Egyptian which before these days madest an uproar and leddest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? Right? Now that had happened. In 54 AD, even Josephus, who's not a Christian but a historian from that time, he records the same event in 54 AD about an Egyptian who had led a group of assassins. Right? That's what he's talking about, these 4,000 men there. He had led a group of assassins to Jerusalem to kill Jews. That was the whole purpose of it, just to kill the Jewish people there. And the Romans actually stopped that, but they didn't kill all of them. They didn't even catch the leader. And so the Egyptian leader, he escapes. Several others of the assassins, they escape. And so they realize that Rome's not going to let that happen. And so what they do is, when you get these thousands and thousands of people who show up for the feast days, it kind of reminds me, you see these pictures of I've never been to New York City, but you see the parade, where people are lined up there and they're just shoulder to shoulder. And you see movies where people in these big cities and they're just walking. You could walk right by somebody and stick a knife in them and keep walking and nobody'd ever know what happened. And that's what they did. After they had that little uproar and tried to have an open rebellion against the Jews, and the Romans stopped that, they kind of went into underground mode, where they're just going to sneak in among the people and kill them there one at a time and just disappear into the crowds. And that's what they were doing. And so that's who this chief captain thinks Paul is. He thinks they finally caught this guy who was instrumental in leading those assassins there. Verse 39 there, but Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. So he beseeches him, he begs him to let him talk to the people. The ones who just tried to kill him in the courtyard there by beating him to death. The ones who are calling for his life. Away with him. Just end his life there. And pretty gracious act. But they're confused. They don't understand. The crowd, some of those leaders have confused them there. They've been lied to. He wants to give them the truth. That's what he wants to give them. And not necessarily trying to clear himself. There in verse 40 he says, and when he had given him license, Paul stood on the steps and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying. Now, he's on those same steps. You remember they were carrying him up to take him into the tower, to get him into the fort, get him away from the people. And so he's up on those steps there, and he beckons with his hands for them to be quiet so he can speak. And they do quieten down. And he addresses the crowd in the Hebrew tongue. Now, I always assumed that the Hebrew tongue was Hebrew. Right? But actually at this time the Hebrew tongue is Aramaic. Right? Now, where did they get Aramaic from? The captivity. When the Assyrians took the northern tribes, they spoke Aramaic. When the Babylonians later took the southern tribes, they spoke Aramaic. And so the dominant language that's spoken among the Jews at this time is Aramaic. It's not Hebrew anymore. They've lost that throughout the years of the captivity there for the most part. And so that's what he's talking about when they speak the Hebrew language there. Now, some of the Jews do speak the dominant language of the area too, which is Greek. But predominantly they're going to know Aramaic. And so we're going to look at Paul's defense of the gospel next time, and we're going to see him turn this negative situation into a positive opportunity to testify about Christ. But when we're faced with difficult situations, we have to understand the same thing Paul understood. God's allowing this. Right? God's allowing it. Right? You could even say God causes it, because God is sovereign. He's in control of it all. Anything that God allows to happen to us, it's His permission. You remember the story of Job. God had Job hedged about. He couldn't get to him until God allowed him to do that. And so you see those things. God didn't do that for naught. God was testing Job, making him better, and in the end, he greatly rewards him. He ends up with twice as much as he had before he started. But God allowed that. Look over 1 Peter 2, and we'll close with these verses. 1 Peter 2:19. But we have to see those things that they come from God. We also have to see them as an opportunity, not just a trial. They're an opportunity to share the gospel. In 1 Peter 2:19-21, he says, "For this is thankworthy, if a man for conscience toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully." She says, "For what glory is it if, when we be buffeted for your faults, ye shall take it patiently? But if, when you do well and suffer for it, you take it patiently, then this is acceptable with God. For even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that ye should follow his steps." And so what Peter was saying is, if you do something wrong and you get punished for it, and you bear that patiently, you just accept the punishment, what kind of reward's that? You had it coming. You earned that. He says, but when you suffer and you did nothing wrong, you were just representing God well, representing Christ well. And he says, now if you suffer for that and you take it patiently, you endure that patiently, then yes, right, that's a wonderful testimony for God. And so he uses that same example of Christ there in verse 21, because Christ also suffered for us. Jesus didn't deserve to suffer, did he? Of course not. But he was obedient to God's will and what the Father chose to allow him to go through. That's what he went through. And so he accepted it. He didn't retaliate, and he used those things as opportunities. Same thing Paul's doing here. Same thing we should do. Okay. Any questions or comments for this evening?